To the cloud. All right. Well, let's get started. I'm Nora Mitchell. I'm going to be moderating this session, and I'll introduce our presenter in a second. Just some business to take care of. Yes, we are recording, so folks can come back and find the recordings later for this session and all sessions throughout the conference. The Zoom captions are enabled, so you can turn that on in the bottom bar of your Zoom window. And feel free to put your questions in chat. I can help with those if our presenter would like, or she can address those directly. And so with that, I'm happy to introduce Liesa Lietke. She will present on inclusivity in humanities education. So go ahead and please introduce yourself more thoroughly, please.
Thank you. I'm Liesa Lietke. I am a professor of art and art history at Laney College, and I teach on several other campuses, including on the East Coast. And I'm coming on 10 years of teaching online. So I have a lot of experience with, different strategies of engaging students online. This lecture will be primarily about content in art history classes and placing it into a context that might make more sense than art history did to me when I thought about it, as an undergraduate. So it is primarily focused on visual art history. Okay. And let's see. So what we know about art is that people make art. All sorts of people make art. People of color make art. Women make art. Everyone. But one of the first ways that we encounter art is looking at museum collections, right? We people go to museums as kids, possibly. So before we ever get art history in school, or some people might encounter it in a museum. And what we see in museums is it's hard to tell that a lot of people make art because according to an examination of 18 major US museum collections in 2018, the artists on the walls artwork is 87% by male artists and 85% white artists. And this is easier for visualizing quantities. This would be the art by white men. White women are the second largest group represented as artists in these 18 major US museums, followed by Asian men, Latinx men, and all other groups combined is this small little dot. So that gives you an idea of what we see when we go to the wall of a museum, right? So I'm talking about shifting perspectives, looking a bit outside of Western art history. So the humanities, art history as taught in the US, are standing upon a Western pedestal. This is my metaphor. It's, the shining column, marble columns of classical Greece and Rome are sort of elevating Western art history as the art history. And we do this silently by making it, the required sequence of courses if you're taking art history, whereas other art history outside of Western art is an elective, or sometimes at the community college level, we can't always offer all different kinds of art history. Luckily, we have some at Peralta. Art history is sometimes synonymous with Western art history in this context. When we say we're taking the sequence of art history classes, and it is Western art history. So as 21st century educators, we can pass on to our students a more nuanced understanding of how we construct this history and what lies outside of it, I believe. I will share a sample of what I have learned about Eurocentricity in humanities education and propose updated perspectives and resources. And I believe our students really are, receptive and able to engage in this and benefit from it. So these tools can help in broaden student understanding of the framing and context of their humanities education, as well as familiarize them with overlooked artists that can expand their understanding of art history. I believe students are better served and more engaged when we encourage critical thinking about the forces that have shaped US culture and the canonical curriculum in the humanities. And learning outcomes for this talk would be to understand context, okay? Be able to position the history of humanities in the Western world within the context of Western colonialism and hegemony. Imagine and articulate more diverse methods of understanding global cultural production and participation, including viewing. The recognized contributions of regions, cultures, artists, and thinkers not generally recognized in the Western canon of the humanities. So we begin, as I said, in museum collections. We see primarily artworks by men of European and European American descent when we go into those museum collections. This is what we see. Whose art do we see? We see, bottom line, the standard European and European American artists. And as educators, of course, we can't change our entire curriculum. We're following, course outlines. We are not, at liberty to upend everything and discard, it's not that I'm suggesting discarding ours, but bottom line, we can supplement this and we can place it in context. Okay, so when a student encounters art history in their education, as I said, it's Western art history. And, we seldom talk about, we say Western art history a lot in the Western world without defining it, at least in an art history class. We can bring that conversation into humanities and art histories classes. So what is generally meant is Western Europe, the dark blue here, some of the former colonies. And you can see that dark blue is, the intersection generally of wealth, whiteness, English speakers, and Christianity. So, South America and Mexico are very far west, and Christian and Catholic in a lot of places, and wealthy in some places, but, but not English speaking. So why are they not, part of the Western world? These are questions worth asking. In fact, I saw this meme when I was putting this presentation together and couldn't resist. We're going on a world tour, US, Western Europe, Australia, Japan. Now, where's the rest of the world when we talk about this? So when we start to teach from the period of ancient art, it begins with Egypt and Mesopotamia. And this is because we mark the beginning of ancient art as opposed to prehistoric, the way we mark the historical period as opposed to the prehistorical period, which is written languages. Okay, so the written languages, the oldest written languages are here. In the legendary Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, these things I remember from my education, what we now call the Africa, Africa and the Middle East, which is of course measured like being middle relative to and east relative to Western Europe. And in my education, the cradle of civilization of the Fertile Crescent was never described as parts of modern day Iran, Iraq, Syria, etc., even in art history classes. And then in the ancient art period, the focus of art history classes shifts to archaic Greek, classical Greek, Roman art history. Again and again thereafter, the Western world, Western Europe and later the US and other colonies, has looked back at this period for cultural inspiration, almost as if wanting to say, here art began, when we know it began earlier and in other places. But the Western world and Western art tends to argue over and over through different periods, including the Renaissance, including neoclassicism, that this was the pinnacle of art that should be emulated. And, of course, US democracy refers back to this period as its inspiration. And so does the architecture that houses our democratic institutions in the US with their classical columns. So Western art culture loves ancient Egyptian art, but not in the same emulatory way as classical Greek and Roman. We don't see period after period striving to recreate Egyptian art the way we do with the classical period in Western Europe. Mesopotamia and Egypt, over here where we began, appear to be forgotten for the rest of the art historical canon. Africa becomes invisible to Western art history. And if you're lucky enough to have African art, then you get to see as a separate class, then you get to see that, right? Or if you're lucky enough to have Asian art, you will get to see civilizations that developed, language during ancient times and produced art in ancient times. But we don't get that at all when we talk about our general Western art history. So this is where the concept, this here in ancient times, where the concept of the Western world is first conceived in terms of Greece versus the Persian Empire. Okay, so there was a West and an East here. And then it carried significance throughout history, the Western and Eastern Roman Empire. When the Roman Empire split, there was this West-East divide along similar lines, always, through the Mediterranean Sea. And then the Cold War, we had a Western and Eastern world and allies, that divided along a line a little bit further to the west, but still this part of the world. So it's got a lot of weight in our history in different ways. So the Mediterranean civilizations would not know about the Americas for millennia, but civilizations there, much, much further west, I would argue, than the West, were thriving and producing artworks during this same ancient period. For example, Olmec civilization, 1500 BCE to 500 BCE. So overlapping even with later ancient Egyptian work. They had a written language from 900 BC in the form of hieroglyphs, but I never learned about this in an art history class. Okay, Olmec heads are one of the most recognizable and known aspects of this culture. So this was a head, predating classical Greece, but overlapping with Olmec written language. These heads are colossal. So here's, for example, a person standing before them. Colossal is defined as twice life size. These are even greater than that. So kind of something that inspires awe and something that, belongs, noted, just like colossal sculpture of ancient Egypt, but we don't get it in our education. So we can just say, as we're teaching, this also existed. Let's take a glance. Here's some resources, for students to pursue if that strikes their interest, and it may. And our students may be from regions with artworks that have not been recognized. Our students may be from here, but have not heard about these artworks. And we can't let the mind narrow into believing that Western art is really the only thing that ever went on. That's what I feel like we owe our students, to not create that sort of fallacy of thinking. So in portrait vessel of a ruler in Moche civilization on the Peruvian north coast, this is 800 BC to 500 CE, overlapping Greece and classical Greece and Rome here a little later than peak classical Greece. But the realism that we see here that really only gets ascribed to classical Greece, the nuance of portraiture, the real reflection of the individual in sculpture. And this is a jar from Paracas in the south coast of Peru, 650 to 150 BCE, again overlapping that vaunted, classical Greek and Roman period, but forgotten from, excluded from Western art history. We can take a peek over at the Americas and say, hey, and these things were going on here. Look at the fantastical distortion of this figure. This is something that we don't see really in Western art until modernism. And in fact, modernism was looking at art from non-Western countries and taking their inspiration from them. So it's almost like why modernism happened, to be honest. And in medieval and Renaissance art, the focus in art history is Europe, 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 some areas surrounding Europe. And this is a time to ask a question: how did these periods get their names? We talked about ancient art history begins when written language begins. When do we transition to medieval, and from medieval to Renaissance? I'll look a little bit at that. What was happening in those sites of ancient art history, Egypt and Mesopotamia, and why do they fall off the map at this point and not get spoken of again in Western art history? And what were some of the ongoing developments of art in the Americas, arguably further west in the Western world, which I don't have examples of here, but a valid question to ask going as you move into medieval and Renaissance period. So the terms used for art historical periods really pivot on major changes in European culture. So if you look at other regions of the world, these periods don't apply. There are different shifts, major shifts that causes big changes in art production and style, and they aren't these. So it's not really accurate to say medieval Egyptian art, for example, or medieval African art, or Renaissance Islamic art, kind of, but not really. Renaissance art of India, because that period, the periods themselves are defined in Western ways. For example, medieval, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire to the end of the Black Plague. So, taking cues from, again, that classical culture. And then the Renaissance from around 1400, after the Black Plague, beginning with the rise of humanistic philosophy, economic changes producing a merchant class, European colonization of other regions of the world, rediscovery of classical Greece and Rome, and this is a big one. This spurred interest in humanistic philosophy, and also advances in mathematics, in sciences, in arts, and in architecture. We think of the Renaissance as, the rebirth, kind of a blossoming of Europe. What's being reborn is the classical period. It's not medieval period being reborn, Europe being reborn. It's classical Western Europe being reborn in the Renaissance period. So, these are the periods of Western art, because meanwhile, the Islamic Golden Age in the Islamic world, which went very far west up into southern Spain, all across the north of Africa, etc., experienced the Islamic Golden Age, 622 to 1258. And what was going on here? Great advances in mathematics, in sciences, in art, in architecture that we don't get, despite their being right up against where we are studying our history. We don't get this art history, again, unless you take a specific class in Islamic art history. But look at what's going on here. And then Renaissance Europe, advances in mathematics, sciences, arts, and architecture. Almost as if, European Renaissance emerged from rediscovery of classical Greek, and that's all it was based on, classical Greek and Roman culture. In fact, yes, but exchanges with the Islamic world, which was way ahead of Europe at that time in many ways in these areas. So that's a part of the story that doesn't really get told. And I think it's a really important one. Again, this is part of placing what we do know about Western art history. It's not about not teaching Western art history. It's about placing it in a context where we understand how it's defined and how it gets shaped. So, quote unquote, medieval artworks from the lands where ancient art history emerged. Do we go back to Mesopotamia, where we looked at ancient art, or Egypt, where we looked at ancient art with great interest, in the art history classes? But no, we don't really see things from later in these very areas where Western art history begins in our education. So Mesopotamia, this is illuminated manuscript called The Elephant Clock from a Book of Knowledge of Ingenious Mechanical Devices. involving a bird, a person, a snake or dragon, an elephant, more people. So different calligrapher and author, and there were many such books like this. Probably Syria or Iraq was the region, modern day Syria or Iraq. So we get these devices, they're Rube Goldberg-like devices, kind of fantastical with, animals playing parts in them, but also advanced and practical mechanical automatons and how to build them, which was not really happening in Europe, but was happening here. So it's so fascinating to just peek over and see what we're not looking at when we talk about Western history. Egypt, which is so vaunted in its ancient periods, as well it should be, is incredible millennia of ancient Egyptian art that's absolutely fascinating and gorgeous and important and relevant. And, when we get to 11th century, so it's medieval period, but we never look at Egypt again. We've gone over to Europe. So this is Fatimid Egypt. And so again, it splits off, Egypt splits off and becomes a different kind of art history class. So when you look at this carved wooden teak panel with horses, with ornate detail, it's not what you would look at and say, oh, Egyptian art. And when I do see something, when we think of Egyptian art as ancient Egyptian art, so you look at art and say, it's Egyptian art, I think, yeah, I wonder what artists in Egypt are making right now. What about contemporary Egyptian art? But we're fixed in, or I have it fixed in my mind. I'll just take responsibility because of my education that Egyptian art means ancient Egyptian art, and we don't get to see the rest. We don't get to see incredible carvings that look almost Celtic, that are influenced by Islam. And even in Europe, so we don't talk about women artists in Europe that much, like Hildegard von Bingen. And I have names now because in the medieval period, names start to be more recorded, where previous works before the medieval period don't always know the artist, in Europe, that is, especially in monasteries, because the production is, it's not about them and their art career. It's sort of service. So Hildegard was a German Benedictine abbess and a prolific writer, composer, philosopher, mystic, and visionary. So this is representing vision, the fire of heaven coming down in flames that look like tentacles directly into her mind. And she's marking it in a wax tablet for her assistants to later create an illumination from. This is Hildegard von Bingen, and she wrote books, religious books, and illuminated them. And it's so very different from other monastic medieval art. She's illuminating her visions that she has in her states of rapture, and they come out looking very abstract. And this is called the universe. And a closer up version of the universe. So there's a lot of art by her, as well as music. I encourage you to look her up. So just saying, in addition to the men of Western Europe, women were also making amazing things. In the Renaissance, Plautilla Nelli was a nun. Okay, this is a place where in monasteries, a lot of women had access to an education. If they wanted to be educated, learn to, become literate, be able to study, not get married and have children, the monastery was a place where it was a thriving world where women would go. And Plautilla Nelli created large-scale devotional paintings, including a recently restored Last Supper. She was self-taught and trained other nuns, establishing an all-nun artist workshop that helped support the convent financially. So she started making work for the convent and then started getting requests and commissions from other churches, other monastic residences, other places for her paintings, and created a whole workshop. So kind of a remarkable person and remarkable artwork. So these are, we're talking about large scale paintings now. This is the Last Supper. It's 6 feet by 21 feet. This is the piece that was recently restored, and it's got everything about the Renaissance going on. We've got accurate perspective. The dishes lying on the table are in perspective. The halos during the Renaissance, in the medieval period, they're really flat and look like a solid helmet. They become a fine line that's drawn in perspective here, getting more subtle in the symbolism, and incredible, anatomical realism. In the Baroque, a lot of people know about Artemisia Gentileschi now because she has, there was a movie about her 10 or 15 years ago. She has exhibits, she's being more recognized, she's in the Met, but sometimes people think, okay, but that's the only woman in our history. Are there more? I've run into people in museums looking at Artemisia Gentileschi and said, I teach a class in women in art history, and the person looking at Artemisia Gentileschi is saying, yeah, I look for her because she's this magnificent woman artist. And I said, I teach a whole class. And she said, there are more, there's not just her. Yes, there's so many more. So in the Baroque, Fede Galizia, Gentileschi was also Baroque. So how could we not know? And this is what, when I started to research for this class, how could we not know about, art like this, that was so magnificently Baroque, so magnificently detailed and masterful, and different in its presentation of the characters of the stories, like this. And then on up to modernism, the focus in a Western art history class is Europe and some surrounding areas. So we can get over to Russia, and European American art. Still no indigenous art, though more inclusion of women and artists of color. And eventually contemporary art, we start to look at the whole world, but tending to be the westernized world that holds a westernized notion of what art is. So that's something to note within modernism, that well, for example, let me just take this example of Picasso's art. Let me just go forward here for a sec. When experiencing art, think to consider the tellers of the story, all right, the ones defining art. If we're telling the story of art history, if Europeans and European Americans, based on a European education, are telling the story art history, the storytellers are the ones defining art, how art should be experienced, how art should be evaluated, what even qualifies. So therefore, what we get is the art of cultures encountered by Europeans during colonization was less valued, if at all, as art, and more valued as anthropological artifacts, or as, in this case, unsighted inspirations for European modern art, as for Picasso and Matisse, for example, just to name two very well-known artists. And apart from Egypt, Africa is a glaring absence from Western art history still, despite Europeans copying it in the most groundbreaking modernist movements, such as Picasso's Cubism. So this is that example. This is a part of the famous painting Les Demoiselles d'Avignon from 1907. Cubism was, one of the best known, most sort of shattering, literally, kinds of movements in early modernism, such that people hated it at first, and then it became, very famous for what it did, what it changed. Picasso is almost synonymous with great art. And this is Mbanga mask from Congo, which he was, acknowledgedly copying African masks in his art. And here's a closer up of that in reverse, that mask, and the detail view of that painting. Here's head of a woman and a Den mask. just to show how he was looking at the way the planes of the face were divided. And, we look at him and say, oh, eyes that don't line up, nose curved to the side. He's so imaginative. And he was looking at African masks and claiming them, as simply inspiration without accreditation. So without reference or credit. So experiencing art, continuing to talk about how the tellers of the story are the ones defining art. For the West, art is absolutely hung on a wall or placed on a pedestal, looked at, read like a text, decoded, understood. It is to look at and think about. It is valued as a unique, precious object that should not be touched. Up until postmodernism, that starts to get pushed, but it gets pushed back. So for the West, art is not a spirit that comes to life. No, you can't say that. That's not, that doesn't align with Western beliefs. That would, yeah. So it's not a god to be danced. Art is not that in Western terms. Art is not a regalia that is sacred and fulfills its sacredness in its use rather than lying inert only to be seen. So there's a great difference in production in a lot of the world and the Western notion of what art is. So this is a Makishi dancer representing the ancestral spirit who assists at the initiation rites of boys among the people of northwestern Zambia. So, Western colonial practices would be, give me this, I'm going to put it in a museum, rather than look at, or anthropologically, we'll look at what they're doing and study that. So this is a video I would like to show because it's a fantastic happening that Sophie Team Shapiro created. So she went and performed a ritual dance. She's a dancer in front of sculptures of Cambodian deities at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2023. So she is Cambodian, and she is going to look at the Cambodian sculptures and pay them honor as the gods that her culture sees them as. And the Met sees them as a work of art. So are you seeing my screen, though? I think I've gone to a different screen.
I see February 28th.
Oh, you do see that. Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, so. Are you still, are you seeing, not sure what happened to my screen share.
You're sharing. I see the tellers of the story are the ones defining art. I see your full screen. Yeah.
You do. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So I would say that these sculptures, when they're taken and placed at the Met, have been taken out of their own context. So they're existing at the Met in an institutional, a European institutional context where they're on a pedestal. You can't touch them. You take your shoes off in front of them, dance to them. You know, they're not, that's not their context. So when she comes back and brings the context back to the artworks, they are this living deity to be worshipped, and I dance in their honor. She's bringing the context that the statues were taken out of back to them. And when she does that, then she's out of context. Then they need to ask her to stop, because she's not behaving like an art patron of a, you know, European art institution in the way that we think about art. So, and the next video on, you know, the tellers of the story and how art is to be experienced is the British comedian James Acaster.
A long time ago, but not long enough ago that's not still very relevant. Everyone in Britain got in a big old boat, and we set sail and we robbed, and this will sound far-fetched, everyone in the world. Do you remember that? What a spree that was. Do you remember the Great Heist? What a spree. We got all the swag, didn't we? And we took it back to old Blighty, and we hid it, this is the clever part, we hid it in a museum. Last place anyone looks. Now it's the modern day, and all them countries who stole stuff from are asking for their stuff back. But don't look worried. We're totally saying a blanket no. Now, a few of you are sitting there. I can see your angry faces. Like, so what? Finders keepers, shut up. And listen, in your defence, finders keepers, shut up has worked very well for us so far. Against all those who've knocked it out of the park, finders keepers, shut up. But even you got to admit, like, if someone stole something off you as an individual, that's your favourite thing, and they nicked it, and you knew who had nicked it, by the way, for a fact, not a hunch. You know who's stolen it. Everybody knows. It's common knowledge. Some people have written books about it. They've definitely nicked it off you. You go to ask for it back, and they're just standing there. They're not even running away. They're twice your size. They ain't scared. They haven't even bothered to hide it. They've done the opposite of hiding it, actually. They put it in a glass display case. It's lit from 7 different angles, real clear what it is. There's no disputing it's the same thing that once belonged to you, because there's a plaque next to it. It says exactly what it is at the top of the plaque, and then a paragraph underneath about how important it is to you and your culture. You'd be forgiven for thinking, I'm pretty sure they haven't got a leg to stand on here. Probably going to take this home today. Must have been so confident, all them countries when they asked for their stuff back. Walking up to Britain, saying to their friends, wait in the car, don't even need you. Be back in a jiffy, mate. Hey, man, a while ago, a lot of your ancestors stole loads of stuff from my ancestors. Yeah, I'm here to take them home. Let's right this wrong. What do you say? They must have thought the British person at the door was going to go, absolutely, you can have them back. We stole them, after all. But instead, we went, I don't think so. We're still looking at it. Yeah, just looking at it these days. There's a lot of other people who haven't seen it yet we'd quite like to show it to. So, not right now, selfish. no sulk about it. Look, there's no hard feelings, mate. Hey, you can look at it. Come on, have a look. Have a look. Seem familiar? Stop behind the rope. That's why the British Museum is so busy all the time. No British people ever go in there. It's full of people from abroad looking at their own stuff. Walking the corridors, reminiscing about the good old days. Then I imagine just openly robbing the gift shop at the end. That is one of you punks.
Let's not go to the jazz music. I'm gonna get lost about how to get back to my slideshow. Sorry. So James Acaster, fabulous commentary on that, I think. So bottom line, looking outside the canon of Western art history, we often are still looking through a Western lens. It's the case for me. My education was in Western art history. So there's more to do that we have to sort of question the assumptions that we end up with after and within our education. So the learning outcomes, again, were position the history of humanities in Western world within the context of Western colonialism and hegemony. And hopefully we got that. Imagine and articulate more diverse methods of understanding global cultural production and participation. So including how art is understood and how it is experienced and viewed, and then recognize the contributions of regions, cultures, artists, and thinkers not generally recognized within the canons of the humanities. So I have some instructor resources that I can, you're welcome to email me for these or take a screenshot of these. And then these are some student-facing materials, and this is my email to reach me on. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Absolutely amazing. I've traveled in South America and in Europe, and so much of what you're saying is so spot on. As I go through Peru and I'm realizing there was a lot of stuff going on here at the same time as what is so commonly understood in Europe. So yeah, really important perspectives. So thank you so much for that. All right, so I'll go ahead and stop recording.